My name is Crystal and I am the host of Stories from Palestine podcast and also a licensed tour guide by the Palestinian Ministry of Tourism. Together with my colleague Salim, we are organizing 3 10-day programs this year to discover Palestine. There is still space in the upcoming program mid-March and also in June and October. We travel around the West Bank, Jerusalem and Jaffa with small groups, maximum 10 people. We provide historical background, we introduce you to the Palestinian heritage, and we make sure that you get to meet a lot of locals. We stay in family-run hotels, and we also spend 2 nights with Palestinian families. We do some short hikes, easy hikes, and during the October program, you can also join a day of olive harvesting. If you are interested, then check out our website for more information. I will ask Roberto if he can add a link to the show notes of the podcast, but you can also write it down. It is storiesfrompalestine.info.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that I'm presenting you the second part of the mini-series dedicated to Jerusalem Quarterly 92. In the first episode, I asked the authors to talk about the contribution, to talk about the articles, and I also asked Palestine, as a guest editor, to talk about the general theme of the issue, dedicated to Jerusalem's paths not taken. In other words, to those projects that were prepared, discussed, sometimes partially implemented, but never fully fulfilled. So today with Palestine, Harris Ford, Semigo Catalai, Michel Campos, Yair Wallach, and we're going to delve into the specific of the various stories. So we're going to hear about the Jerusalem Light Rail, again, from the Ottomans' first plans to the Israeli implementation of this idea. We're going to hear from Harris Ford talking about the Special Municipal Commissioner in Jerusalem. We're going to hear from Yair Wallach about the unbuilt parliament and the British colonial plans for a legislative assembly in Jerusalem, as well from Palestine, discussing the 1963 general plan for Jerusalem, prepared by the Jordanians. This is also the plan that, in a way, made possible the publication of this issue. Lastly, we're going to hear from Maria Chiara Rioli, who worked with Vincent Lemire, discussing the potentiality of the archives of Jordanian Jerusalem, an untapped source of information for a bit of history of a city, which we don't know that much so far. But first of all, I asked Palestine to just sum up the various articles to give us a sense of how they look together, and then I will take it from there and start interviewing the various authors. Palestine, back to you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the the way all of us engage differently with this issue of past futures, and Yair and Harris pointed out an important element, of course, of their contributions, which is that these are also, some of these plans are also foreign imposed plans that were interrupted. But what they point to is that at each moment in history, there have always been alternatives. And I think that this is something that we tend to, or a lot of people tend to forget as historians. I don't think we do. But people are very much impressed with the present, and this forges a particular reading of the past. And I think that this is one of the things that these different articles show. I mean, they show how important it is to break free of what we know happened afterwards, and to really appreciate these different plans for what they were at that moment, what ambitions they represented. Were they foreign led, or were they indigenous? And in that way, to really complete the historical record. I think this is one of the things that that each of these contributions basically manages also to do. And I like the idea of using the archive as a store for the future, the way Jacques Derrida expressed it. And I think this comes out very nicely also in Maria Chiara Rioli's contribution. And this is where there is a certain relevance for today and for thinking about the future also.
I want to start asking a question to Yair. This issue is about reclaiming the past, and one thing that's made me think about what I'm going to ask is very much, about the idea of walking around Jerusalem, and you get to see the signs of various pasts in plural. But one of which that is often forgotten is the British colonial past. So I was wondering, can you actually talk about a British colonial Jerusalem? Is there such a thing? And is there any visible legacy there other than few monuments or plaques that are obviously part of British Jerusalem? Can we really talk about, this idea of Jerusalem as a British colonial city?
Yes, I think it's a very good question, because I think Jerusalem is entirely, a British colonial creation to a large degree. What we see today, but it is in ways that are hidden, not obvious. It's camouflaged very, very well. I think if you think of the monument for the British forces that occupied the city in, Upper Lifta or Romema, it's a very understated monument. It's not. It's almost bizarre how understated it is. So you can get a sense that they've just passed through; they were never here. And that's also, I think most people that know something about the history of Palestine, Israel, would probably know the bombing of the King David Hotel. I never thought about it. Why were the British headquarters located in a hotel? What's the logic there? And I think within that, this kind of idea of the British as, they just passed through, they just stayed there as guests, right? This kind of hapless referees, they kind of found themselves in a situation between two sides, and they didn't know what to do, and they tried to solve it, and then they just kind of retreated. That's the kind of narratives that we get as kind of stuck in between, almost by accident, and that's a very useful narrative in many ways, but hides the fact that they thoroughly shaped first the country, but also the city. Think about, what have happened. What if Jerusalem wouldn't have had the stone decree? So you would have a city built of concrete. I don't think you could advance the same claims about, sanctity, if the whole city was built of concrete and so they've given a very, very powerful language to create this illusion of an ancient holy city in what is, a city that most parts of it are much newer than Manhattan. And I think that's so in terms of town planning, they set the ground rules, the vision that is then later on taken by local players for their own agenda, whether it's, Jordanians or the Israelis, And again, different agenda in 67, different agenda today. But what I think unites it is a certain colonial agenda that takes it from the hands of the local people and their interests towards some kind of bigger visions and also create this illusion that this is essential. This is how the city is. There's no way to change it. It's always been this way, and so forth. That's a very, very powerful myth that I think the British have done enormously to consolidate.
Harris, I have a question for you. I was fascinated reading your article by the very fact that, and you talked about it, that essentially the United Nations created their own problem in order then to solve it. But I have a subtle question. Did they ever believe in the project of creating a special municipal commissioner? In other words, did they ever believe that this could have worked for Jerusalem?
I think they wanted to believe. Whether they actually believed or not, I think there was a real desire to believe. There's a lot of what we're discussing and what has been brought up in this discussion, in this special issue as well, is grapplings with modernity and progress as well, especially in the top-down aspects, through like Ottoman designs for railways at the tail end of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, that's a grappling with modernity in the same way that the British were looking to reinvent Jerusalem through architecture and more civil infrastructure as well. So the United Nations inherited this legacy not only of Jerusalem being this stagnant supposed place that is maybe not as old as we think, and the special municipal commissioner was a way to promote that kind of Western branded progress and the problematic aspects of progress as well. So having a mayor, having that person in place to govern Jerusalem, to oversee the supposed inherent conflicts that were viewed a lot more religiously than politically at times, was a very convenient way of compartmentalizing the issues as well. So that belief in the special municipal commissioner may not have been there entirely, but that desire for it to be there and that hope, because there was a hope throughout all of this as well. Even through the imperial ventures, there's this hope of remaking Jerusalem in a way that's more Ottoman, that's more British, that's more Jordanian, putting the stamp on the city that's internationally recognized and making it their own city, without much local consultation. That's another theme that runs through this a lot, is where is the local aspect? Where are the discussions with Palestinians? Where are the discussions with peoples living in Palestine? You just don't see that very often, which is not shocking when you look at this as colonial and imperial ventures. Just with the grapplings of modernity, with the grapplings of problematic progress as well. This desire to believe that the one missing piece, or you're just one step away from having this unified Jerusalem, of having, in the case of my article, a United Nations governed Jerusalem. I don't think there's much foresight of what this would look like 5-10 years down the line, let alone 50 years down the line. This was a very immediate project that really came to fruition like 2 weeks before the creation of the State of Israel, and was abandoned not much after also. So this was a stopgap. If the British only stayed in hotels in Palestine. The United Nations only stayed in hotels and poorly packed their luggage as well. So the hope was there that this would allow for the time to formulate a bit of a better plan, but the fact that this future was interrupted so abruptly did not allow for that next step of the plan to be constructed. And the United Nations has been dealing with that ever since, because this was also a chance to start the peace process in the peace processes in a much better way, and that was bungled from the start. And we continue to see how the ongoing peace processes have been stymied, not solely because of the special municipal commissioner, but this was an opportunity for the United Nations to set a much different tone than the mandate system, than the League of Nations, than this idea of protection. And they chose imperialism instead of empathy.
Palestine, talking about the question of locals, I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how Jordanians envision Jerusalem and how Jerusalemites were part of this plan.
Yes, thank you, Roberto. The municipality of Jerusalem during the Jordanian period was made up of many Jerusalemites. So it's not a question, there's no dichotomy, there's no sort of, let's say, distinct Jordanian vision in that sense. What there is of course a vision of the Jordanian state. And the Jordanian state was particularly concerned with the relative place that Jerusalem would occupy compared to Amman. That was a real issue, and it's really interesting to actually read the development of both cities in parallel at certain moments. There's the whole question, for example, of the airport. I mean, Jerusalem had an airport, which is where today's Kalandia checkpoint is. And it was one of the most important airports, actually bringing also tourists not only to the West Bank, but also to Jordan. So it was a really important entry point. And that changed when the airport in Amman was upgraded. So there's many different ways in which it would be useful to read the history of those two cities in parallel. It's also interesting to see how some of what I would describe as Jerusalem's modernity before 1948 was displaced from Jerusalem's western neighborhoods that were ethnically cleansed in 48 to Amman, because this was a place where people who had the sort of educational and professional background as many of these residents of Western Jerusalem had were needed. The Jordanian state was only just beginning to be constituted, and they needed people who had that sort of experience in mandate administration, which is where many people living in West Jerusalem had also worked as professionals. And you have institutions, you have schools, you have clubs that move basically from West Jerusalem to Amman. So that's a whole another way actually also of looking at the relationship between these two cities, and also between the West Bank and Jordan.
Michelle, I have a question for you. Obviously, you talk about the light rail from the Ottoman times to 2011 opening under a sort of Israeli rule of Jerusalem. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the differences between the two, because obviously we're talking about transportation, and both projects were meant to move people around the city. But the context, as you mentioned earlier, are very different. Obviously, when we talk about Ottoman Jerusalem, we're talking about a city which was mixed, and while we do have obviously communities gathering around their own ethnicity or religion, but certainly it was an open city. Whereas today, the tram line seems to follow apartheid lines. This is a word that you use, and I see that too. And so I was wondering if you can take us through differences between the Ottoman projects and the Israeli one with a little bit more details, also talking about the politics of the project itself.
Sorry about that. So you highlighted a really important difference, which is the lines of the tram itself and the ways in which they follow political lines, not only of the current moment, but of course those that were imposed after the 1948 war. And in fact, a large part of the tramway goes through the former no man's land that divided West and East Jerusalem after the 1948 war until the 1967 war. So the main differences are really in terms of the demographics of the city, right? So today the city is up to 38% Palestinian, largely concentrated in the Old City and East Jerusalem, as opposed to West Jerusalem, which has a largely, almost exclusively Jewish population and some foreigners. And the tram lines very much reflect this urban segregation that is a result of the 1948 war, and as well as policies to keep the city divided between the two populations. And, this is also something that, it didn't begin in 1948. We see this urban segregation beginning already in the Ottoman period. In the British period, we have the first division of transportation lines. So you have exclusively Jewish bus lines that are now sprouting up to service the Jewish population of the city, and a split between where people live and how they get to where they live. And I think that, goes hand in hand with their vision of for whom is the city, and how they identify with the city. So that would be the second big difference today in Jerusalem, is that the municipality obviously represents the Jewish population of Jerusalem, and it represents it in the vision of Jerusalem as the unified capital of Israel, full stop. So Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem do not have, obviously they don't have citizenship, they only have residency rights, and even those have been under attack over the last decade. As with many Palestinians losing those residency rights for absences from the city. And they don't have representation on the Jerusalem Municipal Council. So they don't have any say in the expenditures of the municipality, certainly not in terms of the social services or urban transportation services or stops that are built. As I mentioned before, only one of the 10 proposed tram lines in the future would service East Jerusalem. So the current tram line does have 3 stops that are adjacent to Palestinian neighborhoods, but they really are along the way to the Israeli settlements in the north of the city, as opposed to having been planned to help Palestinians get to and from their city, their use of the city. So between kind of the segregation and the politicized lack of representation for Palestinians in the city that the tram line really does reinforce. It's also, I think, going back to this question of whose city is this? What is Jerusalem? For whom is Jerusalem? Who belongs here and who gets to benefit from it? The tender who has the concession for the tram line has made it big. A lot of to-do about the fact that, Palestinians are up to 24%, I think, of the daily passengers. They're using the tramway. It obviously serves them as well. But what we see is that, of course, Palestinians have very mixed feelings about it, and their use of it is a reflection of the division of the city and their relative lack of access to public transportation. Palestinian bus lines service East Jerusalem, but they don't often, cross into other parts of the city that Palestinians might need to go to. And so I think there's a lot of this public relations that the tender of the tram line, that the Jerusalem municipality, that the Israeli state tried to use to show that, this is an open, globalized city for this population, when in fact, as other contemporary scholars have shown, this really does reinforce and serve to legitimize the Israeli occupation and of East Jerusalem, and to reinforce its claims to a unified city.
I have a couple more questions, very quick for everyone, and it's basically the same. So starting with Yair and then again Haris, Palestine, and Michelle, I wanted to ask you whether or not there is a legacy of the unfulfilled project that you discussed in your articles, and if so, what is this legacy?
I mean, one legacy, obvious legacy is the fact that the large plot of land, which is adjacent to Talbiya and Rehavia, that was state land. It was bought with a lot of money. And that served for quite a number of public institutions, which are very important ones. So I mentioned the President Mansion, but also the Van Leer Academy, which is it's a Van Leer Institute, which is a kind of leading progressive higher education think tank and so forth. And the Academy of Science, and I think also the Israeli Institute for Democracy, and the Jerusalem Theater. So these are quite important institutions. Most of them are very committed to an Israeli version, which is a very Jewish exclusive one. But they are built on their presence there as a result of something that was supposed to serve the inhabitants of all the countries. And I think that's something that, if we are aware of it, then it's something that at least people in these institutions should be aware of it as well, and potentially opens discussions. I would say also that I think that, and what I hope is that the images of these models would circulate, because they're important. They're important to say that this is not some this is something that could have happened. In the same way that, you see people using stamps or banknotes of the mandate and so as kind of visual symbols. And I think that's a potentially also useful visual symbol. That this is the idea of Palestine as a unitary state with all its kind of the problems with it is something that was really there. But I don't know if the pictures will play that role or not. But for me, it was quite a shock to see them in the first place. And I should say that some architectural historians have written on this. David Krojanka, Adina Hoffman, and Ron Fuchs, who wrote his PhD dissertation, and he wrote quite a lot about this building, but this never filtered to public discussion.
Yeah, with legacies of the special municipal commissioner and the general internationalization process as well, continuing into today, I'd say is the exceptionalized nature of Jerusalem as well. So the city that already had plenty of religious importance and was elevated up as well. But when you're trying to cookie cutter and elevate a city for government purposes, that's going to take on a certain mythology as well. And this mythos of a more political Jerusalem needing one neutral observer for it to be peaceful, and that needed to come from the United Nations as well. And I think this comes back a little bit as well to what Dr. Campos was mentioning too, of who belongs in Jerusalem, and this was a moment of real questioning of who belongs in Jerusalem too, because the appointed leader against his will, like the title of I did not want the job. Harold Evans did not really want this job, went to somebody from the United States. So this was not a Palestinian. This was not a Zionist or Israeli. So somebody from the United States, and just what the optics of that is as well, of who belongs in the city, who can govern this city, and we've seen through continued Israeli movement of government buildings and offices into Jerusalem and the attempts to make Jerusalem the capital of the Israeli state as well. The United Nations made Jerusalem and helped solidify Jerusalem as a city exempt from the rest of Palestine as well. And that has continued to really work against a lot of the peace processes, and has continued to alter the urban landscape as well of Jerusalem, not only tactically on the ground, but also really importantly in imaginations as well.
Well, to talk about the legacy of an urban plan for a divided city is a sort of heavy task, I find. Because of course, I mean, the plan had to deal with what actually existed, meaning an extremely truncated, disadvantaged city in terms of infrastructures, in terms of space, in terms of capacity to expand in any sort of meaningful way also. So I think what Jawad and I found particularly important was the idea for these residential neighborhoods. They almost feel like they're out of touch with the reality that existed in East Jerusalem at the time, and that still exists, and even more so today. Because it really sets out an almost utopian idea of self-contained neighborhoods, sort of built around like a common area with playgrounds for children, with streets thought in such a way that they would be safe to cross for children on their way to school. I mean, it's almost a utopian sort of scheme that we very much held on to in our discussions. We were very much inspired by this idea how starting from a place that was extremely crowded, they were still able to envision something that that was really well thought out in some ways.
I am struggling to find any positive legacy from the tramway story. If we think about another contemporary transportation project on the horizon in Jerusalem, which is the cable car that would go over the Palestinian village neighborhood of Silwan to facilitate access to the Jewish quarter into the Old City for Israeli Jews. It's a similar sort of, the continuation of expropriation of Palestinian land and ignoring Palestinian presence or any say in the city, and literally zooming past them or flying over them in the city to try to conceptually, if not practically, erase them from the city. That said, I mean, I think there definitely are NGOs on the ground in Jerusalem that have been working against this erasure, either from the perspective of, trying to underscore the city as a shared city. So think about Iramim or Emek Shaveh, and the efforts that they make to give tours to foreigners and to Israeli Jews to understand the city and to understand the struggles of the Palestinian population. So that's one effort. You also, of course, have tremendous efforts among Palestinians in Jerusalem to develop their own parts of the city, whether the Old City or to develop East Jerusalem, against heavy odds, right, with not a lot of financial support, but the kinds of historic preservation and rebuilding and institution building that like the Welfare Association is trying to do, or that other Palestinian organizations are trying to do for Palestinian Jerusalem, would be obviously an improvement on the city. But I find that it is hard to think about. There are just so many missed roads that were, from the Ottoman city and this Ottoman tramway proposal. Not that it was perfect by any means, not that it was a utopia by any means, but we're just so far from that it's hard to find this any room for optimism.
I have one last question, and I really want to ask all of you briefly, if you can tell us if there's anything that we didn't talk about, but you want to highlight in relation to your paper. Yair, if you want to go first.
I think for me, what was interesting, and this is partly, I co-wrote this with my student, Julio Cirujano, and his whole project is about the ambiguous state that is created in Palestine. You have state building, but it's not clear what kind of state is being built. And I think that kind of ambiguity and confusion that the British have throughout is what's interesting about this project. In a way, kind of explains why it wasn't built, because, when it's unclear to them what are they doing exactly, they miss the opportunities to do this. But at the same time, to think about historical contingencies, because, as I said, it was very, very close to being built. So, almost they went forward. And so a lot of times when we think about roads not taken, it's something about accidents, something about structure, and how do we kind of, as historians, think about the interplay between the two? These are kind of interesting questions.
Yeah, not too sure. One thing I would like to highlight a little bit more is just how discombobulated this whole effort was by the United Nations. In May of June of 1948, there's just a flurry of telegrams being sent back and forth and amongst different people. And there was appointments of different people in certain similar positions as well. Like we see Count Folke Bernadotte being given his position as well around this time. And everything revolving around Palestine for the United Nations was done very haphazardly and very much on the fly. Nobody seemed to know what was actually going on. And the people who were making decisions were at UN headquarters in New York State, whereas everybody doing the action was in Jerusalem or in Palestine. So we see this gap across the ocean that's extremely evident in the archival records, and extremely evident as well of how the United Nations viewed Jerusalem as well. It was a city that it could impose whatever it wanted onto it. It didn't warrant full attention. It was, and this whole thing was imperial as well. It's easy to look at the early United Nations and maybe give it a little bit of a pass as well. If it was trying to figure things out, it was trying to work out whatever issues of the transition from the League to United Nations. But at its heart were these imperial nations, these imperial countries that were trying to continue the mandate system with a little less British influence, but still with the full imperial influence as well. And you can see the back and forth aspect is not so much about how can this be better for Palestinians, for local people, but how can we appease ourselves? How can we mitigate these colonial imperial rivalries as well in the city? So the whole thing was a mess from the outset, and it's no wonder that it failed. Not only from the UN perspective, but also the pure lack of consultation of anybody in Palestine doomed this project from the outset.
Yes, one thing that struck us also in reading this 1963 comprehensive plan is that the authors insist very much that they were trying to do urban planning in very unnatural circumstances. They were always referring to the division of the city and the state that this had led the eastern part of the city into. And there's also a mention of urgent problems that the municipal council would ask solutions for in the course of the consultations that were going on around this urban plan. So we get a real sense of the very difficult daily life, also for a municipal council functioning in Eastern Jerusalem at that time. And when we compare this to the introduction of the 1966 plan that was formulated by Henry Kandel, who was the urban planner in charge of this dossier for the Jordanian government, and who had been in charge of this dossier for the mandate before that. This sort of contextualization sort of falls flat, which is really interesting. It's a very, the introduction is reads very sterile, and we don't see any of those unnatural circumstances, no reference at all to the division of the city and what that entailed. And so I'm curious, I didn't have a chance to look at, I didn't actually get my hands on the entire document written by Kandel, but I think that might be a nice future work of research to just compare how this was sort of cleaned up and turned into a much more normalized sort of document of urban planning compared to the original comprehensive plan, which gives us a real sense of the difficulties that existed on the ground.
Yeah, I just want to go back to this question of the archives, and you all have talked about the wonderful sources and tropes that you found, traces of these interrupted futures or these moments of Jerusalem that could have been different. And yet, I think at least for me working on the tramway, yes, there are traces of this proposal in this project, but I'm also struck so much more by the silences and by the absences. I did find in Al-Quds newspaper, they discussed the project or the proposal a couple of times, but it was very difficult to get a sense of to what extent people who were not trying to get the concession to build the tramway knew about it, what they thought about it. And so what I tried to do was to think about, how it might have serviced different parts of the city and people living in those parts of the city in terms of urban mobility. But it's really hard to get a sense of to what extent it really would have mattered to other residents in the city. So I guess I'm just, again, as I'm teaching now the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the classroom, and I am struck yet again by how imbalanced the sources that are available, the surviving sources are in general. And then, of course, for the classroom in the United States, how much fewer of English language sources there are to share with students. And so I'm really thrilled that you all have found those traces of those archival traces and have brought these stories to a broader audience, because at least here in the United States, it's still an upward battle in terms of trying to re-educate people as to the history of the region and the complexities of the region and the city, of course.
Thank you all for contributing to this amazing issue. And I just want to remember Falestine Naili as the guest editor of Jerusalem Quarterly issue 92, and all of the authors, Harris Ford, Semigo Catalay, Michel Campos, Yair Wallach, Julio Moreno Siruano, Ilan Pappe, Jawad Dukhan, Falastin Naili, Vincent Lemire, and Maria Chiara Rioli. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Roberto.
Yes, thank you.
This concludes this mini-series dedicated to Jerusalem Quarterly issue number 92, Jerusalem's Interrupted Futures, guest edited by Falastin Naili, with articles by Harris Ford, Semigo Catalay, Michel Campos, Yair Wallach, Julio Moreno Siruano, Ilan Pappe, Jawad Dukhan, Falastin Naili, Vincent Lemire, and Maria Chiara Rioli. Please take some time to browse the Jerusalem Quarterly website. At palestine-studies.org, you can find the link then to Jerusalem Quarterly, all of the past issues. Remember, the Jerusalem Quarterly is free, and you can download all of the articles from day one to nowadays. And stay tuned for future episodes dedicated to issues of the Jerusalem Quarterly.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.